Hello. I didn't realize I was coming to Woodstock. See the mud. So welcome everybody. This is a great day. You know, library is a place where we create information, we steward information, and in the library, no less as on any other quarter of the campus, when somebody publishes a book, it is a wonderful thing, and we like to celebrate it. So we're here to celebrate the publication of Allison Levy's new work, House of Secrets. And I'm here to kick things off and then get off the stage. So Allison is here in the library as our digital scholarship editor for our innovative Mellon Digital Publications project, and she's been a terrific leader within the library in that project and really developing new horizons in this field. She is an art historian herself. She was educated at Bryn Mawr and has taught in many spots in the US, Italy, and in the UK. Allison has published widely on the visual culture of early modern Italy and serves as general editor of the book series Visual and Material Culture, 1300 to 1700, published by Amsterdam University Press. And as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Allison, the program is that you will be reading and then you will be talking. To contextualize the reading and talk about the work more broadly. And then you will be discussing.
That's right.
And
yes.
your interlocutor will be Sheila Bond. There you are. Good. I was looking for you. And Sheila is an archaeologist and architectural historian, specializing in the study of medieval sites and their representation. She is currently professor of the history of art and architecture and professor of archaeology. And her excavation work has also extended far and wide in England, France, and Israel. She is currently directing the Monarch excavation and research project in northern France at the Augustinian Abbey of Saint-Jean-de-Vigne in Soissons, Carthusian House at Bourg-Fontaine, and the Cistercian Monastery at Notre-Dame d'Orchamps and the Mother House at Tiron, which, for those of you who actually speak French, forgive me. So without further ado, then, I will turn it over to my excellent colleague, Allison, to bring us in to the House of Secrets.
Thanks, Joe. Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you in advance, Sheila. The book was published just very recently, and I have presented the work now in London and Florence, in New York, 3 cities where I have lived, where I wrote most of the book, and so those events were very meaningful to me. But I think that what feels most right right now is being here today with all of you at Brown in the library, presenting my book to colleagues and friends with whom I work every day. So thank you for coming out, and I promise to entertain. Also, Joe, I'd like to present a copy of the book to our collection. So this is for the library.
Thank you very much.
So let me bring us into this House of Secrets. So the book House of Secrets is a story of desire and memory. It is about the stories that structures hold and the stories that we invent to fill those structures. This is not an architectural history in the classic sense, but rather it's a character-driven history of this house. Over the course of 6 chapters, one for every century that the House of Rucellai has persevered, I will introduce one of the most eccentric characters to have lived in the house at that time. And together, these portraits will combine, will amass to present a single portrait of the edifice itself. So we will meet Alamano, a 13th century ancestor who was a merchant, and he discovered a precious purple dye, and this is how the family made its wealth, by processing this dye with urine, and they literally made their name from oricella, the Italian word for the dye, to Rucellai. We will also meet, of course, Giovanni Rucellai, the third richest man in Florence in the mid-15th century, the patron of this great house, and his architect, Leon Battista Alberti, the archetypal Renaissance man, arguably the most important architect of the 15th century. He was called in to put a face on what was Giovanni Rucellai's physical and emotional labyrinth. He famously wrote in his notebook, "From 8 houses I made one." So location was everything to him. He started off with his father's very modest medieval townhouse, and over the course of 30 years accumulated enough property that he could then call in an architect to mask this strange structure. We will also meet Giovanni's sons. One in particular stands out, Bernardo, the youngest son and his father's favorite. This is a commemorative marriage print. He married Nannina de' Medici, the sister of Lorenzo the Magnificent. And this is a very topsy-turvy image. We see Bernardo as the mast of the merchant ship, stripped down, while his new bride is ornately outfitted. So there's a very interesting role reversal happening. Yes, you should laugh at this. It is quite funny. We don't often see Renaissance man this way. And of course, they would leave the city. It was a lot to live under Giovanni's roof, and so they preferred to live at one of the country estates, and the book goes into the sort of playground that they had set up there to escape the rigidity of Florence. But the family declared bankruptcy early on, and Giovanni was forced to sell that country estate, so the newlyweds had to come back into the city and eventually settle in Palazzo Rucellai. And then in the next generation, this is a son of Bernardo, this is Paolo Rucellai, who in his father's garden oversaw the dissection of a monster, what today we would refer to as conjoined twins. So it wasn't all parties. There was a lot of gore in the Rucellai history. And then moving into the 18th and early 19th century, this is Mariana Rucellai, another bridal image, this painted on the eve of her wedding. And I like very much that we don't see, these are blank pages, we're not sure if she's erasing something or just setting out to inscribe something, but I like to think that she's sort of looking away, reflecting upon another Rucellai bride of the century earlier who is rumored to have hurled herself into the courtyard on the eve of her wedding. And then bringing us into the 19th century and the Anglo-American community that would sort of arrive en masse in Florence. This is Henry Layard, the English archaeologist and politician who, as a young boy, lived on the piano nobile of Palazzo Rucellai. So at that point, the Rucellai had to open up their doors, had to begin renting to non-family members. And this is an altarpiece, once in the palace, now in the National Gallery, London, Filippino Lippi. And later in life, Layard writes in his memoirs about a fight that he had with his brother at the time, and one of them threw a shoe at the other, and it dented the frame. And he claimed that he could still see that nick at the National Gallery. I've looked for it, but there are a lot of nicks these days in these old paintings. And then this very colorful, even toxic character, Lizina Rucellai, who married into the family from Russia. And she was famous for her tango teas that she held in the palace. She was related to the assassin of Rasputin. This is a fabulous cross-dresser, Felix Yusupov, who visited his cousin Lizina in Palazzo Rucellai after the Russian Revolution with these diamond earrings tucked into his pocket. They once dangled on the lobes of Marie Antoinette, but now Felix in exile had to start selling off whatever he had taken out of Russia in order to keep caviar on his exile table. So he was looking for a buyer in Florence, but at that point, certainly the Rucellai could not afford these earrings, and they eventually went to Pierre Cartier, and they are today in the Smithsonian. And so she had a wide circle of friends. This is Harold Acton, the aesthete said to be the inspiration for Anthony Blanche in Brideshead Revisited. He had his own grand estate, Villa La Pietra, which is now the site of NYU in Florence. But he was a frequent guest, and he wrote in his memoir about these parties fueled by champagne, and the Italians refer to them as orgies. And this is Gabriele D'Annunzio, the poet of the decadent movement, no surprise, and influencer, I suppose, of Mussolini. So this was Lizina's circle of friends, and they had fun in the palace. This is the futurist artist, Tayat, who debuted on the Piano Nobile, the main floor of the Palazzo, this unisex, modernist jumpsuit, this one-piece jumpsuit known as the tuta. And so it was all the rage for a while in the summer of 1920 in Florence. And then here, as recently as 1997, one of the residents, Alvise de Robilan, a Venetian nobleman renting a room in the Palazzo, was brutally murdered in the house. And that was 10 years before I moved in, and we occupied the same floor. So he and I had a certain connection. The mystery remains, the murder remains unsolved today. So these are some of those portraits, some of those characters whose lives have played out in this house over 600 years. And there's also a second narrative that runs through my book, and that is the story of my own residency in Palazzo Rucellai, a year of living with ghosts, of walking in footsteps, and of sharing a space within a structure that shapes lives as well as survives all of them. So I am going to read now several passages from the book, from the personal narrative. So the book opens with me, a burned-out assistant professor of art history, in need of a break. And so I have a sabbatical lined up, going to Florence to write a book on tomb sculpture, and I'm looking for an apartment. The description was discreet. Living room, bedroom with stone fireplace and wood beam ceiling, antique terracotta floor, fully equipped kitchen, bathroom with tub, tastefully and elegantly furnished, third floor with elevator service, located in the famous Palazzo Rucellai. I had to read it twice to make sure it wasn't a figment of my imagination. For this wasn't just any building, this was the structure that started it all. Centuries of conoscenti had idolized the palace, and rightly so. Palazzo Rucellai was the first private building with its groundbreaking facade to establish the vocabulary of Renaissance classicism. I, by comparison, had worshipped the palace a mere 20 years, ever since that fateful semester back in 1987 when, as a newly declared art history major, I enrolled in a seminar on its architect, Alberti. Yet my devotion could hardly be paralleled. I knew the palace intimately. That is, I knew it as well as any art historian could know it. I'd even seen it in person, quite a few times actually, each visit a transcendental experience. From the far corner of the tiny piazza opposite the palace on Via della Vigna Nuova, I would stand transfixed. Without fail, Palazzo Rucellai, on my every pilgrimage, delivered exactly what I was looking for, or rather, what I'd been trained to look for. The 3 stories of imposing yet accessible height, divided by 2 friezes intricately carved with family emblems. The pilasters of varying orders and application echoing the elevation of the Colosseum in Rome. The bold cornice, at once crown and tamper, bestowing grandeur and gravitas in one bold stroke. All there. Nothing superfluous, nothing unexplained. It had come to serve as a sort of confirmation of the rule, this checklist, a reaffirmation of my faith in art, beauty, and the ideal. With its promise of deliverance, the facade of Palazzo Rucellai continued to beckon, and I, ever faithful, never ceased to heed the call of its architect, that, as Alberti wrote, one's gaze might flow freely and gently along the cornices, through the recessions, so that anyone who saw it would imagine that he could never be satiated by the view. But looking at it again and again in admiration, would glance back once more as he departed. Because I'd always lingered longer than necessary, I knew, too, that the stones blushed at sunset and that the cornice wept during torrential downpours, that only 11 of what had once been 14 torch holders remained hammered into the 7 window frames on the piano nobile, and that each and every one of those wrought iron rods cast upon the golden facade at high noon a grim shadow, a temporal stain resembling a noose already taut around a traitor's neck. And the glass panes hanging within those gallows I'd observed long ago shook with every passing city bus. Far below, the built-in bench accommodated an ever-changing huddle of Florentines, wearily awaiting transport elsewhere. I'd often perched on that pockmarked surface myself, not waiting to leave, but rather wishing to stay. Reclining on the hard, unyielding seat until my shoulders awkwardly attached to the cool sandstone, I would slouch there and stare out into the piazza before me, breathing in the building at my back as the cellar exhaled moist air against my dangling ankles. On one such occasion, glued as I was to the facade, I turned my face parallel to the palazzo and noticed that a certain T. Bartlett had left his autograph to the right of the main portal in 1868, and that that same door, not surprisingly, was lacking a knob. I even knew what the place looked like on garbage night, the only time this handsomest of facades appeared at all compromised. But I'd never crossed the threshold. I'd never even tried. Because for me, Palazzo Rucellai had always remained a venerable exterior, a massive wall of sandstone, there to be admired at a remove. The palace was still in family hands, after all, closed to the masses. End of story. Until, that is, I fell upon the Contessa's advertisement. A week into my stay, and I was still tripping over the impedimenta of the nobility. It was a far cry from the anemic housing I'd had as an academic. Suffice it to say, I was living large among orphaned heirlooms, quietly nestled upstairs in a repository of Rucellai disinheritance. To be sure, the apartment had been aptly named, but Archivio stored more than just cast-off furniture and chipped china. It was also, I began to perceive, a guardian of secrets, a keeper of memories, a confidant who had heard it all. As an outsider invited in, I found myself living between floors, between centuries, between lives. Or so I mused when I should have been unpacking my books. As I was the sole tenant, Nico the porter had let this slip on day 2. I'd been enjoying myself immensely, having effectively the run of the house. Nico lived there also, but only Sunday evening through Friday evening, and he slept in an alcove just off the courtyard. Well past retirement age, the guard was safely tucked in every night by 8 p.m. That's when, as a morgue-like hush fell upon the palace, I would roam the halls, knocking on blind archways, daring the ghost to wake. I took great delight in swishing down the marble staircase, bowing to battered portrait busts of adopted forefathers at every dusty landing. I even took the liberty of sorting through the family mail, which still passed through a slender slot carved to resemble a foreshortened Roman sarcophagus, or, I like to think, a parted mouth. Though I knew that Florentines had long made a habit of recycling family names, standing there in the vestibule, fingering a certain Giovanni's correspondence, took my breath away. I also went behind the scenes and between the walls. I drew back curtains in quarters that were not mine to enter, enjoying views of the city that only Rucellai eyes, I like to imagine, had taken in. And I discovered in a rear corner of the piano nobile, tucked not too far from a tiny rectangular chapel, a disquietingly narrow spiral service stair, which ran unilluminated from the tip-top of Palazzo Rucellai to rock bottom. Adding to the sense of peril was the absence of a central solid axis. In lieu of a supporting pole, let alone a railing of any sort, was a brittle rope, knotted at regular intervals and suspended some 70 feet. With steady steps, I began the ascent, my left hand tightly grasping the knuckles of the fiber pendulum as my right hand trailed flatly along the enclosing wall. I didn't manage to complete a single revolution before I seized up with fear, if the Contessa found out. Rather than lose my footing in the dark, I returned to the front of the palace and jimmied my way into the ballroom. I entered easily enough, only to discover that the enormous square room with its white-on-white wedding cake styling was already occupied. Gambling overhead was a gaggle of gauze-draped maidens in varying degrees of undress. I kept my head cocked back for a good 5 minutes, titillated by the fresco, its sensuality heightened by a sorbetto-tinged palette. Perfectly besotted with these rococo beauties, I floated up to join them on top of the world. Enchanted, I remained. What was I looking for, breaking and entering my way through Palazzo Rucellai after hours? There was the novelty of the address, undeniably. That I now possessed a key to the front door of Alberti's magnum opus exhilarated me. But my stealth meanderings through the house weren't merely of an academic nature. There was also something achingly personal about my movements, the way I fingered the mail, or the way I cupped doorknobs, even the way I sank into and petted the upholstered furniture. All of these gestures betrayed a dire and unapologetic covetous on my part. For what I'd finally found in this house, I believed, was my home. After a full day of luxuriating in Palazzo Rucellai, I geared up to leave the building. Even from the ground floor, no fewer than 3 locked doors stood between me and the street. And these weren't just any locks. They were 300 years older than the Liberty Bell, with a set of hopelessly unwieldy keys to match. This antediluvian mechanism of simple warded lock and crude bit key offered minimal security and maximum stress. It took longer for me to exit the palazzo, for example, than it did to zigzag to my favorite enoteca, an elegant wine bar tucked away in a ground floor room just off the courtyard of a family palace to rival the one I was living in. We go way back, this venerable Florentine house and I, their entry-level blend having been my weekend read of choice throughout graduate school. Though no enophile, I knew that the family had been making wine for just about forever. And it came in the most handsome bottle on the Chianti shelf, the label and engraving of a Tuscan villa set within a formal garden of cypress, olive, and clipped boxwood, the perfect house red for an Italian Renaissance art historian in the making. Then, years later, on a trip to Florence for dissertation research, I made the link between the winery and this family palace and began drinking in situ. Now, as a professor with a cushy fellowship, I could even afford to take an occasional meal here. On my first night back, Francesco, the perfectly seasoned manager, standing squarely behind the wood and copper bar, its semi-matte countertop handsomely scarred by decades of bottle dings, slowly began to polish the bright surface in front of him. When he asked where I was living, I assumed he'd be impressed with my reply. Palazzo Rucellai. Why on earth would you want to live there? As Francesco poured, I proceeded to summarize for him the merits of Alberti's architecture, but still he was unpersuaded. Less of my lecture on the facade, it seemed, than on my decision to reside behind it. Vediamo, he said with a wry smile, we'll see, and slipped into the kitchen. We'll see what, I wondered. I took a long sip and began to swirl. Did this layman know something I didn't? The next morning, indulging my curiosity about the palace's local reputation, spurred by the prospect that there just might be something more to Palazzo Rucellai, I headed out, reader's cards in hand. So I will throw myself into the history of Palazzo Rucellai, voluntarily losing myself in libraries across Florence and in the house itself, seeking out the old world at every turn. And before long, I find myself mixing with a social set that was not my own. This included what I might today describe as a romantic misadventure with a Florentine nobleman whose ancestor, Ugolino, was consigned to hell by Dante for allegedly eating his own children. But I digress. So here I pick up about halfway through my sabbatical. I continued to see Lorenzo, my own Il Magnifico, though we rarely met in Florence. Instead, I'd take the second-class regional train over to Pisa, then down the coast to his winery, from where, usually after a bubbly lunch al fresco, we'd depart, flying as far from Italy as his turboprop could take us, Dubrovnik, Paris, Vienna, and innumerable points in between. For the Grand Renaissance Commander, yes, that was its actual model name, the Grand Renaissance Commander required no more than a 3,000-foot landing strip, or as Lorenzo called it, a runaway. Indeed, I'd spent the majority of the fall semester running away with him on short notice, and my passport had the hastily made impressions to prove it. Mauve and gray smudges from over-inked stamps, haphazardly hammered down, quickly accumulated on the once spare light blue government pages, paying no mind to boundaries, blotting out any trace of my former life as a commercial flyer. I had other travel trophies too, these of shiny brass and nickel, Cunha, Florence, and lei. I kept the foreign coins in little felt pouches from Prada and Gucci that had once held extra buttons and care instruction cards. You see, I'd been spending what was left of my stipend on clothes and accessories, well, more suitable for palace life. For Palazzo Rucellai had finally acknowledged my presence, albeit in fickle ways. The house was often indulgent, coaxing me into the courtyard on silent nights, enticing me to run my hands over its girdled columns. Other times, it was decidedly uncharitable. One Sunday afternoon, returning home after a lazy lunch at Trattoria Camillo, my key broke as I was extracting it from the lock on the second set of entry doors. Knowing I'd be going out that evening, I propped open the uncooperative threshold with a brick. When Nico got home and read the explanation I'd left for him, his reprimand made even the house shake. He threatened to report my breaking of house rule number 1 to the Contessa, but upon realizing that he too would have hell to pay, settled on a firm finger wag and a gruff retreat into his alcove. Figuring I ought to lie low for a while, I tried to refocus on my research. It was bad enough that I'd deserted my sabbatical book project altogether, but the fact that I'd taken a hiatus from my house homework was starting to gnaw at me. My cherished library visits had grown few and far between, and I wasn't the only one to notice. At the bar in Piazza San Marco, where I'd regularly down a cappuccino before heading up to I Tatti, the barista asked if I'd been in the US. And in the reading room, I noticed on my first day back, my Wi-Fi password had expired a month earlier. At the Kunsthistorisches Institute, my unofficial locker had been taken over by an ambitious graduate student, and my tessera glared with more blank squares than stamped ones. I'd missed several lectures at Villa La Pietra, and half a dozen email requests for letters of recommendation from my students had gone unanswered. I was determined to get back on track. Soon enough, however, I found myself newly distracted. On the occasion of my upcoming birthday and to commemorate my Florentine period, the Marchese commissioned a portrait of his professor. Having spent the first half of November plotting, I was finally ready to sit for my portrait. On the face of it, donning royal purple, given my address, seemed apropos. But where, at the dawn of the 21st century, could I possibly find a garment dyed with oricella? Instead, I decided, as a specialist of widow portraiture, I should wear black. A subtle nod to the academic life I'd somehow ended up putting on hold and was slowly letting bleed out. The painter was an American expat, approximately my age, who'd established himself in Florence 15 years earlier. His passion was plein air landscape, but he earned a living by making his noble patrons appear noble. His studio was located in Piazzale Donatello, just north of the Old English Cemetery, about a 30-minute walk across the Centro from Palazzo Rucellai. Initially, I enjoyed my mornings there immensely, but the excitement of posing soon waned as the process dragged on and genuine melancholia set in. Sitting stiffly in the studio for weeks on end, breathing in the heady fumes of linseed oil and turpentine, I thought at length about the art of painting, about subjects and about surfaces. Which self was I projecting, and which was I concealing? As I sat in my Prada weeds, I couldn't help but think of Virginie Gautreau, the eccentric widow from my native city, who, through John Singer Sargent's scandalous gaze of 1884, had become Madame X. What, midway through this sabbatical, had I become? A blank slate, a black hole, Professoressa X? And what did Lorenzo want with a portrait of a professor anyway? Though my surname outdated his by millennia, I couldn't see him hanging my image on one of his walls. An academic among the aristocrats? But then again, as much as Lorenzo prided himself on his portrait collection, it probably could use an original. Historically, non-partible inheritance law, still the norm among the Florentine nobility, kept the contents of a palace in place. By this practice, Lorenzo's picture gallery likely consisted of copies of paintings inherited by his brother. Perhaps then the presence of an art historian would help to authenticate Lorenzo's art collection. Yet aside from that, what would this patrician gain by grafting an American professor onto his rootstock? I began to wonder if Lorenzo's generous commission was less a validation of me than of himself. And I have one last section to read. I know we're short on time, but I think I can get through it in just a few minutes. And I selected this final passage because this was not originally in my manuscript, which was complete when I arrived at Brown almost 2 years ago. But here I was in a library that I had not yet explored, and I couldn't help myself. And so I explored the catalog and the stacks and made a discovery which I think really makes the book. So I'd like to read a little bit from that section on the one hand to sort of round out this abbreviated narrative arc that I've painted for you today, but also as an expression of my gratitude to the collection of the Rock. Okay. So this is the final chapter of the book, and now I'm relaying some information about Alvise de Robilan's biography, the man who was murdered in the Palazzo. On 30th of April 1956, the 31-year-old nobleman married the 25-year-old American model Betty Stokes, said to be one of Emilio Pucci's favorites. The newlyweds settled down in Grottaferrata on the outskirts of Rome, and on February 3rd of the following year, Betty gave birth to the couple's first son. A few months later, Betty's friend from Lexington, Virginia, the abstract expressionist Cy Twombly, traveled to Italy to be with her. I'm going to skip a passage here of Betty reflecting upon that visit in the summer of 57. And she says that he set up a studio in the house and he painted a lot of portraits there. Cy took several photos also, one of a postpartum Betty. In one especially moving portrait, Betty stares out of a window, her left hand flat against her heart. Her neck protrudes as though longing to connect with something beyond the room. Yet her eyes appear glazed over. Her face betrays not a hint of a smile. Betty at the window, cornered, in her word, stuck. 10 years later, Twombly, now fully settled in Rome, would paint Betty's husband and now father to 3 sons. Portrait of Alvise de Robilan of 1967 is one of a series of 7 nearly life-size portraits that Twombly made of a group of friends from his earliest years in Italy, which included Paul Getty and Giorgio Franchetti, the latter an early champion of Twombly's work and eventually his brother-in-law. This is Franchetti. Alvise invited my sister and me to a luncheon at a country house that he had rented. That was how we met this young artist, who was very elegant, very handsome, very aloof, but actually highly emotional. After lunch, he showed me the drawings he was doing, and I was dumbstruck. What an intensity, like an electric current. They were obviously charged with such power and mental vibrations that I received the message. Twombly's early intensity had only amplified by the time he portrayed his now 41-year-old friend de Robilan. Using oil-based house paint, graphite, and wax crayon, Twombly created a multi-layered monochromatic abstract rendering of de Robilan. The only indication of the sitter's identity is his name scratched in large, loose letters across the top of the canvas. The figure is composed of nervous lines, frenetic attempts at obliteration, erasure by marking. Swift, spontaneous gray hatching against an off-white impastoed ground yields visible pentimenti. De Robilan's is a painful portrait, unrecognizable, violated, raw. Pulsating like an electric current, Twombly's painting of 1967 eerily foreshadows his friend's vicious murder. For exactly 30 years later, this vision of a destroyed de Robilant would be fully realized. Twombly's pictorial prophecy aside, what happened to Alvise de Robilant on the night of January 15th, 1997, remains within the walls of the antique Palazzo Rucellai, as the press reported. Indeed, this house, both witness and accomplice, will never tell. And then, at the very end, I am back in my apartment on that same floor. As I stared at the stone and plaster membrane that separated the crime scene from my apartment, trying to disentangle truth from fiction, I realized that the more intriguing mystery was not so much who had killed de Robilant, but who had died there. For it is precisely such uncertainty that defines the man and his murder, the inability to ever know the tenant on the third floor. Though our residencies didn't overlap, I felt a certain connection with the departed de Robilant, both of us subscribing to the belief, like so many before us, that the palace is a place of opportunity, a place where identity can be assumed as desired, two tenants with much to gain and maybe a thing or two to hide. Sheila, just watch your step.
Yeah, should we stand?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. If we sit, can you
You
see
can
us?
sit and I'll stand.
Oh, no. I'll stand.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing this book, which many of us in the room have read. My first question has to do with the genre of the book. You've just donated a copy to the library, but where are they going to file it? Is it NA? Is it DH? So it's kind of architectural history meets family history, meets memoir, meets murder mystery.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask about how you made the selections to combine these various genres together, and how you thought about organizing that.
Well, yes, I don't know what the call number will be. I guess that's already been assigned.
Cataloger in the house.
Well, I knew, I did, in fact, go to Florence to write a book on tomb sculpture, but very quickly realized that I was sitting in the middle of a story. I just had to dig around to find out exactly what that story was. So I knew from the beginning that I wanted to write a book for a wider audience. That was something I had decided to do. And I didn't want to write the traditional architectural history. So I really wanted to...
Not that there's anything wrong
no,
with
nothing at all, nothing.
The traditional architectural historian.
And in fact, I wasn't trained as an architectural historian, so I did have to do all that homework so that I could rewrite it. So I didn't escape it completely, and I really came to love it, actually. But I knew that I wanted to take a single site and explore the afterlife of this Renaissance monument. So I knew that I wanted to tell the full story as much as that is possible. And I was particularly very interested in thinking about, what does it mean to be an art historian? And here I was living in this house. And so much of that story is also about me coming to terms with the fact that, in fact, I knew nothing about Palazzo Rucellai beyond the facade. And so the same sort of struggles, I guess, and questioning that I was going through, I wanted that to be part of the story, and I wanted the reader to come along with me on this journey of discovery and self-discovery.
So much of Palazzo Rucellai is about the facade, and of course I've only seen the facade myself. I've sat on that bench as a young person. You peel away, you open it up somewhat, and yet there are still some things that are hidden, including the archivio, which we can't see from the outside. So can you talk a little bit about the tensions between making things public and keeping secrets?
Yeah, great question. In the very beginning, I read that line about the shadow that's cast on the facade like a noose already taut around a traitor's neck. I am that traitor. I am revealing some secrets about Palazzo Rucellai, but not all of them. And that was a great frustration of mine, living in this house. Here I was. I had the key to the front door. I was going through the family mail, but I still couldn't fully penetrate this space. And there were some doors that were locked that I could not jimmy my way into. There was a very disagreeable elevator that trapped me constantly in it. And so it remains a mysterious place. And it very much is a labyrinth on the inside. Despite Alberti's facade, it is really something else on the inside. And you really do have that sense of just wondering how to navigate through this, and you're picking up clues along the way, but ultimately, you know, the house just sort of spit me out. You know, it would only let me in so much.
One last question, because I'm sure people in the audience will have questions. One of the stories you tell but don't emphasize is the history of women in the house.
Yeah.
From Nanina, the overdressed in the boat, to the Contessa who rents you the apartment.
Yeah.
And could you say just a little bit about the history of women?
Yeah. So, you know, in the last 10 years, we've seen finally, you know, a very welcome increase in the scholarship on domesticity, not as a secondary area of study, but as something that is getting a lot of critical attention, and the place of women within the domestic realm as patrons of art, as consumers of material culture. We've learned a lot about the Medici women. Of course, there are a lot of records there about the Medici family. But it's very interesting that in the case of Palazzo Rucellai, the story is still dominated by these two alpha males, Giovanni Rucellai and Alberti. When in fact, throughout my book, I bring women in. We can blame Giovanni Rucellai on this in large part because he removed the women from his family history that he was writing. So my book, one of my objectives is to reinsert them in the history of the house.
Terrific. Well, I will thank you for sharing this
Thanks,
moment
Sheila.
with me, and we'll open it up to the audience for questions then.
Okay, well, thank you first. And second, to follow up with Sheila's question about women, the secret that I think still, you know, it most strangely remains is that you end up just packing up.
Mm.
And you've written the book having already made the decision not to go back to teaching,
Yeah.
but in fact to make your life about books rather than palaces. And you don't give us any of that closure with the way, you know, you don't want anybody to know. So
Yeah.
this is a secret that you've somehow come to a decision. We see you evolving.
Yeah.
We see the palace evolving. So what
Well,
why did you do
that,
that?
I mean, you know, coming up with the right ending to a book is really hard. It is true that in the book, my sabbatical residency is contained in a neat 12-month timeline. In fact, I forfeited that tenure-track teaching position, and I ended up staying in Florence for 5 years. In Palazzo Rucellai for 3.5. So you don't get, well, it would have been much longer. I had to edit myself. At the end of that sabbatical, I actually continued teaching, and I went to London and I taught at UCL. And it was during that year where I really was quite honest with myself, and I thought, I really want to write this story about Palazzo Rucellai. And so that was a pivotal moment in my career because I walked away from teaching at that time. I moved back to Florence. I moved back into Palazzo Rucellai, and I started writing this book. But of course, I was still living the story, so that's why it took 10 years, I suppose. But also, it was during that first year in Palazzo Rucellai that I started my series with Ashgate. So that was, it wasn't just walking away from teaching, it was turning more toward publishing. And so that really would occupy those 10 years while I was also writing this book. And so yes, at the end of House of Secrets, I am startled, sort of, I wake up from my palace idyll, this dream, because an email comes in from the provost's office announcing the first faculty meeting of the new semester, and I have to sort of come out of this, this dream in a way. But yeah, so there are various endings that I could have put in place there. Yes?
Here we are in the jewelry capital of the United States. I'm just wondering, in that handsome portrait of you, is that lovely noose you're wearing the same?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Gorgeous portrait, by the way.
Thank you. Yes?
Highly realistic.
What was the reaction of the Contessa to the book?
Well, there are a few Contessas in my story, but the one to whom I paid the rent,
The
I don't,
landlord, yes.
that one, I don't know. It's only been out in the world a couple of months in Italy. She is a character, sort of well-crafted character through the book. She makes appearances to collect the rent, to explain why I've gotten stuck in the elevator without fixing the elevator. So there's a comic element to her as a character. But this is a good question you raised, because I would really like to underscore the fact that it is still a private home. So it has been in the hands of the Rucellai family without interruption for 550 years. And so living in this space felt very much as though I was living in their home, which made it very, very special.
I haven't had a chance to read the book yet. I'm looking forward to it. But I'm really interested in the relationship between the house's sensibility and aesthetic and how it informed you and affected you, and your sensibility and aesthetic, and how it related to the house. And also the other people who passed through the house, if you felt any sort of connection to them other than the place itself, and what you've taken away within yourself from the experience and how it's changed you.
Wow, Panina, that's a lot
it's
to
a lot.
answer. I'm going to try my
I
best.
want to answer,
Okay.
but it's just because even just looking at the photos, even though
Yeah.
I've never been there, it's so powerful, and there's such a strong energy and sensibility, and it's so enthralling just to even look, even before your story began, and I just looked at the images of the place, and I could see how intoxicating it would be, and I wanted to know what you thought.
Good word. It was very intoxicating. It was surreal. Because, again, I was always conscious of where I was. Despite the element of escapism, I couldn't escape where I came from and who I was going into this house. An art historian born in New Orleans, and in the beginning of the book, I described my childhood home, which was very different, obviously. And I also described the interior of Archivio, of that apartment, which I wasn't able to read today. It was very disconcerting, because you have this gorgeous facade. The structure of the interior is a labyrinth, and then my apartment was really the dumping ground for all of the old furniture and chipped china and stuff that the Contessa didn't want. And so it was, there was for example, I write about an IKEA mat, one of those grass mats that she'd put down on the floor because the terracotta pavement was 500 years old, and so it was not in great condition. But it was covered with this IKEA cheap rug, and every time I walked across it barefoot, I would have a splinter, or the poke of that synthetic fiber, and that was disconcerting to think about being in a 15th century monument, but walking over IKEA. But that was only in my one apartment. So the aesthetic was unusual, and I forgot your second question.
No, just, I was interested.
What did I take
in
from
what-
it?
What, if the experience and the sensibility or the relationship between you and the place.
Yeah, well,
What you'll take with you moving forward through your life.
Okay, so I am the trader because I am revealing a lot of secrets, but I also feel very possessive of this house. I guess because I did learn so much about it and I did have the personal experience of being in it. And so I think I have this very special relationship with this house. In the book, I think it very clearly emerges as the protagonist of the story, and I think in my life it is like an old roommate, I guess, a college roommate that you always have around or something.
There's an intriguing image in the very beginning. I think there were three, and one of it was like a loggia or a courtyard. Did that exist at any point? Is it inside?
Yeah, that's
At
the
the center?
interior courtyard
Oh,
of the
there is.
house, and I showed a
Relative
couple of.
is that-
Yeah, it's a relatively small courtyard as Renaissance courtyards go, and designed by Alberti. Very elegant, but very private. So I also write in the book about when I used to leave the house, I would sometimes pull the front door open really wide so that people out in the piazza could get a glimpse of it, because the family wouldn't let you in, and then I would slam the door shut behind me. So I think that points to my sort of desire to share my experience and knowledge about the house, but also guarding it.
Protecting it, yes.
Yeah.
Did it have a glass ceiling that was so popular that was added to many of these?
No, it's open.
At the time of the Great Expedition, when they built the Crystal Palace, they
Yeah.
enabled that sort of thing.
Right. No, the courtyard is still open, but the loggia of the Rucellai is across the street because Giovanni Rucellai refused to leave that block and there was no more space, so it had to be built across the street. That has been glassed in and it's a commercial space now.
So of maybe the spaces or the stories that did not reveal themselves to you, they remained a mystery, is there one that sort of rises to the top that you really wish you could get to the bottom of? I know there are quite a few to choose
Yeah,
from.
well, I would like to go back into the private chapel. I was just able to poke my head in there once, and it was so quick and it was dark that I didn't get to explore. And there is said to be a corpse of one of the Rucellai saints. She wasn't a real saint, not 100%, but you know, they've given her that title, the family has. Anyway, and she was sort of laid out on the altar there, embalmed for a very long time. I think that the Department of Health has probably removed that body, but who knows? But I would like to check it out and confirm that. And there's also, you know, I couldn't get into all the rooms, that's for sure. And above the piano nobile is an entire floor that is locked, that the family reserves as an apartment.
One more, because the cover of the dust jacket of your book is beautifully designed, and I noticed that there were a number of symbols, one of which you alluded to in the slideshow of the figure that was being dissected. But these little sculptured reliefs around the rondel there, that's in pattern too. I think there's one of the eye that's got wings or something.
Right.
Just wondered, how did you choose among the many sort of visualizations that are there that you...
Those are all emblems that are mainly 15th century emblems of the family and the architect, and they're all described in the book, and just a very talented designer pulled those together, so
Lovely,
I'm really happy.
So I'm going to emulate Allison, that we've opened the door wide and now we're going to close it again. But thank you so much. This has been quite wonderful. I was floored by the portrait.
Absolutely.
That's
Well,
amazing.
yes.
That's like, you know, a bucket list thing for me. But
Maybe for the library website.
So I'd like to thank Allison. I'm sure that as people are milling around, you're probably available to talk a little bit
Yes.
further. But let's thank you for this wonderful experience.
Thank you all.